On the 11th of September 1697, the dawn on the Tisza River in the Hungarian plains was cold, and a mist, like a spectral breath, rose above the water. On the eastern bank, 60,000 Ottoman warriors awaited crossing on a bridge constructed of 60 boats, lashed together by ropes and chains. Like a precious serpent, the pontoon structure lay on the dark water's surface. Its wooden planks glistened with morning dew. Half of the Sultan's army had already reached the western bank. Cavalry, artillery, the imperial baggage train laden with captured gold, all of it was there. However, the infantry remained on the opposite side of the river, protected only by hastily dug trenches and a wall of overturned baggage wagons. They were unaware that 50,000 Habsburg soldiers were approaching from the east. The numbers spoke of miscalculation. The Supreme Sultan Mustafa II commanded an army of 100,000 men, the largest in decades. Prince Eugene of Savoy led a force half that size. Many of his soldiers were so poorly supplied that they marched with rags wrapped around their bleeding feet. But Eugene possessed what the Sultan lacked: perfect knowledge of the enemy's position and ruthlessness. To leverage this, a letter from Vienna, bearing the imperial seal, lay in his pocket, ordering him to avoid battle at all costs. He decided to disobey. The stakes on this exhausted riverbank were rising. Tactically, the Ottomans were divided and vulnerable. Their main forces, cavalry and artillery, were on the opposite side of an impassable barrier. Strategically, this was the culmination of a 14-year bloody war that had begun when Ottoman armies stood at the gates of Vienna. The Great Turkish War had bled both empires dry, and whoever held this battlefield would dominate Central Europe for the next century. But the stakes rose even higher, to the level of civilizational survival. For 300 years, the Ottoman Empire had relentlessly expanded into Christian Europe, consuming kingdoms, enslaving populations, relentlessly advancing westward like a tide. This morning, that tide would turn. This battle shattered Ottoman power in the Balkans. It was the first time an enemy had captured the sacred seal of a ruling sultan. It was the beginning of the long Ottoman decline, the moment when Europe's greatest threat became its sick man, slowly dying for another 2 centuries. And it happened because a 34-year-old prince, watching from an eastern ridge as his emaciated soldiers emerged from the swamps, made a decision that would echo through history. He attacks now, come what may. The sun rises higher. The moment in Zenta approaches. The future of 2 empires depends on what happens in the next 4 hours. To understand why these armies found themselves facing each other on the Tisza, one must go back 14 years, to the summer of 1683, when Ottoman troops besieged Vienna. The Sultan's armies had reached the very capital of the Habsburgs, the greatest prize that had eluded their predecessors. For 2 months, they hammered at the walls while Europe, holding its breath, waited. Then, Polish King John III Sobieski arrived with reinforcements, and in a single day of desperate fighting, the Ottoman siege was lifted. It was more than a defeat. It was a revelation. The unstoppable empire could be stopped. Vienna ignited a crusade. Pope Innocent XI re-aided the Holy League. Austria, Poland, Venice, and then Russia, all united against a common enemy. For the first time in memory, Christian Europe fought as one. The ensuing war consumed a generation. Habsburg armies advanced south, retaking Buda after a century and a half of Ottoman occupation. They took Belgrade. They swept across the Hungarian plains. By 1688, it seemed the Ottoman Empire in Europe might collapse entirely, but empires do not die easily. In 1690, a reorganized Ottoman army retook Belgrade. The momentum had shifted. Habsburg generals, distracted by a new war against France in the west, failed to deliver a decisive blow. The conflict devolved into a bloody stalemate. Neither side could achieve victory. Both sides were losing treasure and men on Hungarian soil. By 1697, 14 years after Vienna, the war had become a test of endurance. The empire that collapsed first would lose everything. That spring, Sultan Mustafa II decided to personally resolve the stalemate. At 33, he represented a new generation of Ottoman leadership, educated, devout, determined to reclaim what his father's generation had lost. Unlike the previous 3 sultans, who had delegated command to their grand viziers, Mustafa personally led his armies for the first time in decades. He had distinguished himself in 3 successive campaigns. In 1695, at Lugos, he personally led cavalry charges. His saber flashed in the front lines while cannonballs whistled overhead. In 1696, at Dulachenchine, his armies routed Habsburg forces and pushed them back towards Vienna. European courts spoke his name with grudging respect. Mustafa prepared his 1697 campaign with religious fervor. When advisors expressed concern about the cost, he responded with words that revealed his nature. "I have no need for money. If required, I will eat stale bread. I sacrifice myself for religion. Whatever hardships arise, I will be patient." And he truly meant it. For him, it was not merely conquest but a sacred duty to reclaim Muslim lands from infidel occupation. On April 18, leaving the Edirne Palace, he led an army of 100,000 men, which included Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry, Tatar auxiliaries, and 87 heavy cannons. The column stretched for many miles, a moving city of soldiers, camp followers, animals, and supplies. By August, he reached Belgrade. His plan was to bypass the well-fortified Habsburg positions along the Danube, push into Transylvania, and attack the empire's vulnerable eastern flank. It was a bold, aggressive move, exactly what Eugene of Savoy was waiting for. Eugene was the complete opposite of the Ottoman Sultan, born in Paris, not in a palace. The son of a French count and the niece of Cardinal Mazarin, he had grown up at the court of Louis XIV. His mother's involvement in a poisoning scandal led to her exile, and the young Eugene's disfavor. Worse, his lean, almost feminine physique drew mockery in Versailles. When he pleaded to be enlisted in the French army, Louis refused, forbidding the little prince from serving in any troops in France. The rejection left a deep scar. At 19, Eugene fled abroad to offer his sword to France's greatest enemy, the Habsburg Emperor. He distinguished himself in battles against the Ottomans. At 20, during the siege of Vienna, he displayed reckless courage bordering on suicide. At Buda, he led cavalry charges under Ottoman artillery fire. At Belgrade, a bullet passed through his knee, but he refused to leave the battlefield until the city fell. By 30, he was a field marshal. By 34, when Emperor Leopold appointed him commander-in-chief of all troops in Hungary, Eugene had spent half his life at war with the Turks. He knew their tactics, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He knew how to defeat them. But when Eugene arrived to take command in July 1697, he found an army in dire straits. Of the 70,000 men on paper, only 35,000 were fit for combat. There was a lack of pay, food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Discipline had collapsed. Desertion was rampant. Eugene acted with his characteristic energy. He borrowed money from Viennese bankers, using his personal credit, and from his own pocket, paid the soldiers their arrears of pay. He executed deserters and rewarded bravery. He trained the troops relentlessly. In weeks, he managed to create a fighting force, but it still lagged behind the enemy in numbers and was inadequately supplied. Facing a sultan determined to retake Hungary or die trying, the stakes transcended personal glory. For Eugene, this was his first independent command, a chance to prove himself worthy of the emperor's trust. Failure meant disgrace, the end of his career, possibly a return to the obscurity he had fought so hard to escape. For Mustafa, the campaign carried the weight of dynastic legitimacy. 3 sultans before him had either been deposed or died in dishonor after military defeats. He needed a victory to secure his throne and the empire's future. But beyond the personal stakes were national civilizational consequences. If Mustafa succeeded, he would regain control of Transylvania, once again threaten Vienna, and re-establish Ottoman dominance in Central Europe. The Holy League would crumble, its members seeking a separate peace. Ottoman expansion, which seemed to have ended at Vienna, would resume, advancing deeper into Christian lands. But if Eugene won, if he could destroy this Ottoman army, the empire would lose its offensive capability for a generation. The Balkans would open to Habsburg conquest. 3 centuries of Ottoman advance into Europe would end, replaced by 3 centuries of retreat. Neither man knew that in 6 weeks they would meet near a small village called Zenta, where one would achieve the greatest victory of his life, and the other would suffer the worst defeat in Ottoman military history. The Tisza River cuts across the Hungarian plains like a scar across a body, wide, slow, and treacherous. In September, after the summer heat had scorched the grass to a brown, the water recedes below its normal level, exposing sandbanks and muddy shores, but it remains a serious obstacle. The current moves with deceptive force. A man in armor who falls into the water will drown before he floats 10 yards. For an army, a river crossing represents a moment of maximum vulnerability. Half your forces are on one bank, half on the other, all stretched along a single narrow bridge that enemy artillery can destroy in minutes. The village of Zenta lies at a natural ford where the river makes a bend, forming shallower water and firm approaches on both sides. It is one of the few places where a large army can cross a river without boats. The surrounding terrain is flat as a table. The vast Pannonian plain, stretching in all directions, covered in grass and sparse woodlands, was an ideal ground for cavalry. It was here that Ottoman Sipahis, with their swift attacks, had terrorized all of Europe. But this terrain, devoid of hills and forests for cover, was also a deadly battlefield for artillery. An army caught in the open and divided by a river would be a field marshal's dream and a sultan's nightmare. In early September, the Ottoman army arrived at Zenta, numbering, according to independent estimates, between 50,000 and 60,000 combat-ready soldiers, though official sources indicated a figure of 100,000. The difference was explained by the presence of numerous camp followers, servants, and merchants in the baggage train, as well as deliberate inflation of numbers on muster rolls, allowing commanders to embezzle the pay of non-existent soldiers. The core of the army was comprised of 15,000 janissaries, elite infantry units, the Sultan's personal guard. They were armed with matchlock muskets, accurate to 100 yards, and in close combat, used swords and axes. These were professional soldiers, many of whom, as children, had been taken from Christian families through the Devshirme system and raised as Muslims, loyal to the Sultan. They had suppressed rebellions from Baghdad to Belgrade and knew no fear. The cavalry numbered around 20,000 horsemen, though many horses were exhausted from the long march from Adrianople. Sipahis served in the provincial cavalry, receiving land in exchange for military service. Each was obliged to provide himself and several of his companions with armor, weapons, and horses. They fought with composite bows, sabers, and lances, using tactics honed over centuries of steppe warfare. In open combat, under skilled leadership, they could defeat any Christian cavalry. However, the 1,697 campaign proved difficult for them. Many of the best horsemen had been sent on raids or garrison duty. Horses were sick, and the army included an unusually large number of recruits, peasants conscripted to fill the ranks, who were more of a liability than a reinforcement. The artillery part consisted of 87 heavy cannons, from small field guns to massive siege bombards, requiring teams of oxen to move. Ottoman artillery had significantly improved in recent decades, adopting European technologies for casting and gunpowder production. These cannons could breach fortress walls and decimate infantry formations from 1,000 yards, but they were slow, immobile once set up, and completely dependent on clear line of sight. If the enemy broke through to the guns, they became mere expensive metal statues. Support for this military force was provided by the enormous logistical tail required by all pre-industrial armies. Thousands of pack animals, hundreds of wagons laden with ammunition and supplies, the personal servants of officers, merchants, religious figures, and the Sultan's own court. The Ottoman army represented not just a military formation but a mobile city with its own economy, hierarchy, and culture. It moved slowly, consumed vast quantities of food and fodder, and required careful management to prevent chaos. Against this force, Prince Eugene commanded an army of 50,000 men, of whom approximately 35,000 were fit for combat after his reorganization efforts. His infantry consisted of 42 regiments, recruited from all Habsburg domains, Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, armed with flintlock muskets that outmatched Ottoman matchlocks, and trained in linear formations that maximized firepower. These were veterans of years of war against the Turks, battle-hardened and possessing that stubborn German discipline that allowed them to hold their ground against repeated cavalry charges. Eugene's cavalry included 9 regiments, mostly cuirassiers, heavy cavalry and half-armor, armed with pistols and sabers, and dragoons, capable of fighting both mounted and dismounted. They could not match Ottoman cavalry in maneuver warfare, but in sustained melee combat, European horses and heavier armament often prevailed. In addition to the main forces, Eugene enlisted Serbian militia under Captain Jovan Tekeli, 12,000 lightly armed horsemen who knew every trail and ford in the region. These men fought with personal hatred for the Ottomans, who had occupied their lands for generations. They served as scouts, guides, and raiders, and it was their intelligence that would decide the outcome of the impending battle. The artillery numbered 60 cannons, fewer than the Ottomans, but organized with German efficiency. Each crew was trained to load, aim, lay, and fire with mechanical precision. Habsburg artillery used standardized calibers and maintained a supply of pre-measured powder charges, ensuring a rate of fire unattainable by Ottoman gunners. Eugene carefully positioned his guns, knowing that in a single day, they would have to destroy the Ottoman army before it could slip away. The turning point in intelligence came on September 10. Serbian scouts observing the Ottoman army reported that the enemy had reached Zenta and begun crossing the Tisza. In a minor skirmish, Pasha Kafa, an Ottoman officer commanding a reconnaissance unit, was captured. Presented to Eugene and under threat of immediate execution, Kafa revealed all. The Sultan with his cavalry had already crossed to the west bank, along with the artillery. The infantry remained on the east side, protected by 2 hastily erected trenches and a barricade of overturned wagons. Crucially, the outer defensive trench was unfinished, with a large gap in its northern section. The pontoon bridge was the only means of retreat, and it was already choked with troops and supplies moving in both directions. Eugene listened to this intelligence with the coolness of a master anticipating his opponent's next move. He instantly realized the opportunity presented. The Ottoman army was divided and vulnerable, its strength neutralized by the river. If he could reach Zenta and prevent the infantry's crossing, he could drive them to the water and destroy them utterly. However, there were complications. Imperial orders, delivered in yesterday's dispatches, instructed him to act with extreme caution and avoid a general engagement, unless unconditional victory was assured. Leopold feared another bloody stalemate that would drain Habsburg resources while France threatened the western frontier. He wanted to preserve his eastern army, not risk it in a gamble. Eugene convened his senior commanders for a council that evening. Guido Starhemberg, his most trusted subordinate, passionately argued for an attack. The moment was perfect, perhaps the only chance to catch the main Ottoman army in a vulnerable position. If the Sultan was allowed to withdraw now, the war would drag on for years. Others expressed caution, pointing to the exhaustion of the troops and the risks of attacking a numerically superior enemy. Eugene listened to all arguments. His face betrayed no emotion. Then, he made his decision. They would march at dawn, a forced march for 10 hours over difficult terrain to reach Zenta by noon, in time to attack before nightfall. It was a calculated risk that would either elevate his reputation or ruin it. The night before the battle passed in preparations, soldiers cleaned their muskets and checked their powder, knowing a misfire in combat meant death. Officers walked among the men, offering words of encouragement or threats, depending on their leadership style. Priests confessed and blessed, sprinkling holy water on kneeling soldiers. Some prayed silently, lips moving, entrusting their souls to God. Others sharpened their blades with a rhythmic scraping that sounded like conversation. A few wrote letters they would never send, knowing that if they fell tomorrow, no one would deliver word home. Veterans slept when they could, having learned to rest before violence. New recruits lay awake, imagining what tomorrow would bring, their stomachs clenched with fear. Eugene did not sleep. He studied maps by candlelight, memorizing terrain features, visualizing the forced march and deployment for battle. He wrote a brief letter to the emperor, explaining his decision to disobey orders, a document that would serve as either an exoneration or evidence at his court-martial. He checked his weapons, a pair of pistols, a cavalry saber, though he knew a field marshal commanded from horseback, not the front lines. But battles had a way of drawing leaders into the chaos. Better to be prepared. Dawn arrived cold and gray. The army formed up and began its march east to Zenta, to a battle that would change the map of Europe. The soldiers began to move before sunrise, picking their way through the darkness toward an unseen enemy. The route Eugene chose lay through marshy terrain, along paths known only to locals, through land that would conceal their movement from Ottoman scouts, but make every step an ordeal. Here, the Tisza had numerous tributaries, streams, and marshes that turned the plain into a labyrinth of mud and water. Men sank to their knees in hidden bogs. Wagons got stuck, requiring dozens of soldiers to pull them out. The smell of rot rose from stagnant pools where vegetation had decomposed for centuries. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, finding exposed patches of skin, spreading diseases that would kill more men than Ottoman bullets. Eugene galloped up and down the column. His horse splashed through shallow water, urging them on. Every hour counted. If they arrived too late, the Ottoman infantry would finish crossing and escape. If they arrived too early, before exhaustion forced the enemy to stop for the night, the Sultan might notice their approach and retreat. The timing had to be perfect. His scouts rode ahead, maintaining contact with the Serbian militia, observing the Ottomans. Messages came back. The enemy had not moved. They were still crossing. The opportunity remained. By noon, the men were beyond exhaustion. They had traveled 8 hours through terrain that would have tested even fresh troops. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and swamp water. Feet bled inside boots not designed for such exertion. Some soldiers collapsed, unable to rise. Officers prodded them with swords, shouting that any straggler would be given over to the mercy of the Turks, which meant torture and death. Most struggled to their feet. A few remained lying in the mud, prematurely dying of exhaustion, awaiting the horrors that lay ahead. At 2:00 p.m., a courier from Vienna caught up with the column. He had ridden for 2 days, nearly killing his horse, to deliver sealed orders from Emperor Leopold. Eugene accepted the leather portfolio with the dispatch, broke the wax seal bearing the imperial eagle, and read the message inside. The words left no room for ambiguity. Act with extreme caution, avoid all risks. Do not engage the enemy unless there is overwhelming superiority and near certainty of victory. This was a direct imperial command, backed by his authority as Holy Roman Emperor and Eugene's oath of fealty. Disobedience was rebellion, potentially treason. Eugene carefully folded the document, tucked it inside his tunic, and said nothing to the courier. He ignored the order. He did not change his plans. The column continued its march. In his mind, he had already justified his disobedience. The emperor had issued those orders without knowledge of the situation. If Leopold had known that the Ottomans were divided by the river, stranded in the middle of their crossing, more vulnerable than ever, he would have ordered an attack. Eugene was not defying his sovereign. He was acting as his sovereign would, if fully informed. It was a rationalization, but it allowed him to proceed without the burden of guilt. At 3:00 p.m., the swamp finally gave way to firmer ground, and the vanguard reached a low ridge from which the first clear view of Zenta opened up. What they saw justified every mile of suffering. The Ottoman army was spread out on both banks of the Tisza, a vast encampment of tents, wagons, and men stretching as far as the eye could see. The pontoon bridge was visible, a fragile line across the water, crowded with soldiers and animals still trying to cross. On the eastern bank, perhaps 40,000 Ottoman infantry waited in a semicircle, protected by trenches and overturned wagons, their cavalry and artillery uselessly positioned on the west bank, unable to support their comrades. The trap was even more perfect than Eugene had dared to hope. But the Ottomans saw them. Alerted Ottoman scouts on horseback pointed and shouted, galloping back to their camp with news that shattered the day's calm. Within minutes, alarm drums began to beat, a staccato rhythm that carried across the flat terrain. Officers ran through the camp, shouting orders. Soldiers grabbed their weapons and ran to defensive positions. On the west bank, Sultan Mustafa watched the unfolding disaster, unable to help, separated from his infantry by a river that might as well have been an ocean. He had made a fundamental mistake in warfare, allowing his forces to be divided in the face of the enemy. Now he would pay for it. Eugene allowed himself a thin smile. Then he began issuing orders for deployment, his voice carrying an absolute certainty of a man who knew he had already won. The Habsburg army deployed from marching column into battle formation with practiced efficiency. This was the result of years of training, the ability to turn chaos into order under the eyes of the enemy. Infantry regiments moved to their assigned positions. Each commander knew his place in the larger formation. Cavalry dismounted. Soldiers checked girths and drew weapons, preparing to fight on foot where horses would be more of a hindrance than an advantage in the coming trenches. Artillery crews manually moved their guns into position, already calculating range and elevation for targets that would soon be struck. Eugene's tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would array his army in a great crescent, like a bow drawn around the Ottoman bridgehead. The curve of the formation would allow him to direct maximum firepower at different angles, preventing the enemy from concentrating their defense. General Guido Starhemberg would command the left flank, positioned along the riverbank, with orders to probe for weaknesses and, if opportunity arose, cross the Tisza at a ford to attack the Ottoman rear. The right flank would assault the trenches directly, absorbing losses to fix the enemy. The center, under Eugene's personal command, would wait for the moment the Ottoman lines began to fray, then commit reserves to break them entirely. The key to the entire battle lay in destroying the pontoon bridge. As long as this lifeline existed, Ottoman soldiers could flee to the west bank, and the Sultan could send reinforcements to the east side. The bridge had to be destroyed to trap the infantry by the river with no hope of retreat. Eugene meticulously positioned his artillery, 60 guns, arrayed in multiple batteries with overlapping fields of fire, their primary target. The pontoon bridge of boats and planks, the Ottomans' only hope of salvation. On the Ottoman side, the Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, understood the magnitude of the unfolding disaster. He was 38 years old, a man of outstanding intellect and physical beauty. His name meant diamond, and he had achieved his position through merit, not birth. He understood perfectly what was about to happen. The Habsburg army would attack before nightfall, destroy the bridge, and annihilate the infantry trapped on the east bank. There was no good way out. He could order an immediate retreat across the bridge, but the structure would not withstand a panicked crowd. It would collapse under their weight, drowning thousands. He could create a defensive perimeter and hope to hold until nightfall to escape. But the trenches were unfinished, and his men were exhausted. He could attack, attempting to drive back the Habsburgs before they completed their deployment. However, his cavalry and artillery were on the wrong side of the river. Elmas decided to defend. He sent riders across the bridge to Sultan Mustafa II, pleading for reinforcements and asking that the cavalry cross the river upstream and attack the Habsburg flanks. He ordered his janissaries to form up behind the trenches with loaded muskets and dry powder, ready to sell their lives as dearly as possible. He placed his best officers in command of each section of the perimeter. Then he drew his sword and, walking among the men, spoke calmly, reminding them that they were the Sultan's chosen soldiers, that paradise awaited those who fell defending Islam, that their names would be sung in songs for 1,000 years. The janissaries listened with grim faces. They were professionals. They understood the situation, but they did not break. They did not run. They loaded their weapons and waited for the enemy to come within range. Whatever happened in the next hours, the Sultan's infantry would not die as cowards. On the plain, the Habsburg artillery completed its deployment. Artillery captains shouted ranges, crews loaded powder and shot, fuses smoldered, ready to deliver the first volley. Eugene raised his hand, surveying the line of his army, ensuring each unit was in position. 50,000 men stood ready. Weapons gleamed in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of grass, horses, and fear. Eugene lowered his hand. The cannons roared. The sound of 60 cannons firing simultaneously was not merely a sound but a physical force that struck the body like a fist. The thunder rolled across the plain, echoed off distant hills, causing flocks of birds to erupt into the sky with cries. Smoke billowed in a solid white wall, obscuring the gunners, and drifted down the slope toward the Ottoman positions. Then came the iron. Balls weighing 12, 24, 36 pounds flew through the air with a speed too great for the eye to follow. They were heard before they reached their target, a rising whistle, ending in a thud. The first volley was aimed at the Ottoman trenches and the tightly packed troops behind them. Solid shot, with equal indifference, pierced earth, wood, and flesh. One ball struck a wagon wheel, shattering it into splinters, and continued on to the men sheltering behind it. Another skipped across the ground like a stone on water. Each bounce tore off a limb or a head before it buried itself in the mud. A third struck directly into the trench wall, collapsing an entire section and burying the defenders under tons of earth. But the main target was the pontoon bridge. 10 guns concentrated their fire on this fragile structure of boats and planks. The first shots missed, sending up geysers of spray. The gunners adjusted elevation, reloaded, and fired again. A ball struck the third boat from the west bank, puncturing its hull and sinking it in seconds. The bridge sagged, its planks groaning under the strain. Ottoman soldiers crammed into this section realized the danger too late. They tried to flee, but on this narrow structure, hundreds of men, all jostling in different directions. The bridge swayed, the ropes groaned, more boats began to take on water. On the west bank, Sultan Mustafa II watched the bombardment with growing horror. He had ordered his cavalry to find a ford and cross to attack the Habsburg flanks. But the Tisza proved wider and deeper than it appeared, and no easy crossing could be found for miles. His artillery was useless on this side, unable to elevate its barrels high enough to fire across the river at the enemy guns bombarding his infantry. He was the Sultan, commanding 100,000 men, and he could do nothing but watch his army die. The Habsburg infantry began its advance. They moved in lines. Each regiment maintained its formation. Flags unfurled. Drums beat the march. At first, the distance was 800 yards. The effective range of Ottoman muskets was perhaps 100 yards, meaning the Habsburg soldiers had to cover 700 yards of open ground before they could return fire. But the terrain was flat, and the approach was good. They moved steadily forward, boots pressing into the grass, the sun behind them casting long shadows across the field. At 500 yards, Ottoman artillery on the east bank opened fire. A few light field guns that had crossed the river before the bridge came under fire. The cannons were poorly positioned and had limited ammunition, but they served their purpose. A ball punched through the ranks of a Habsburg infantry company, instantly killing 3 men, and another dozen before that. The formation closed up. The soldiers continued to march, stepping over bodies. Another shot struck the standard-bearer, taking his head off. The man next to him snatched the flag before it fell, held it high, and continued marching. At 300 yards, some janissaries could not restrain themselves and fired their matchlock rifles, despite the excessive range. White smoke billowed along the Ottoman line. Bullets whistled overhead. Most fell short. Only a few found targets due to the sheer volume of fire. Dozens of men fell in the Habsburg ranks, but not yet in great numbers. The real slaughter would begin soon enough. At 100 yards, Habsburg officers shouted commands. The lines halted, dressed ranks, brought muskets to their shoulders. 5,000 flintlock rifles were aimed at the Ottoman trenches. The volley, when it came, sounded as if the earth itself split apart. A wall of lead swept across the defensive position, striking men in the trenches, in the wagons huddled behind inadequate cover. Bodies twitched and fell. Screams pierced the smoke. The janissaries replied, their own volley erupting seconds later, and now both sides were obscured by such thick gunpowder smoke that the sun became a dim orange disk. The battle had truly begun, and it would not stop until one side was annihilated. In the suffocating smoke and chaos of close-range musket fire, individual soldiers lost all sense of the larger battle. They saw only what was directly in front of them, the next man to kill, the next piece of cover, the next few seconds of survival. But from his horse, Eugene maintained a wider view. He watched the right flank, where a grinding battle with Ottoman trenches was unfolding, one that would yield no decision, only corpses. He watched his artillery continue to batter the pontoon bridge, which sagged lower with each impact, but stubbornly refused to break completely. He watched, waiting for the moment to commit his reserves and turn a stalemate into a slaughter. That moment came on the left flank, where Guido Starhemberg made a discovery that changed everything. The Tisza River, as seen from the east bank, appeared uniformly deep and fast, but Starhemberg's scouts had waded into the shallows, probing the bottom, and they returned with astonishing news. 300 yards upstream from the pontoon bridge, a sandbar extended halfway across the river. During high water, it would have been submerged and useless, but at the low water levels of September, a man could wade across in waist-deep water. Infantry could cross the river there. They could outflank the Ottoman positions and attack from the rear. Starhemberg did not wait for permission. He ordered 2 infantry regiments to shed their heavy equipment, fix bayonets, and follow him into the water. The soldiers looked at him as if he were mad, then obeyed. They entered the Tisza, gasping at the cold, feeling the current tugging at their legs. The water rose to their waists, to their chests. Soldiers shorter than average had to swim. Muskets were held overhead. Powder horns kept dry. They stumbled over hidden rocks, supported each other when someone slipped, and continued moving toward the far bank. The Ottomans defending the bridgehead did not notice the flanking maneuver until it was too late. Their entire attention was focused forward on the Habsburg army attacking their trenches. When the alarm cries finally sounded from the rear, when officers turned to see Austrian infantry emerging from the river 300 yards behind their defensive line, the trap had already sprung. The Ottoman troops were now surrounded on 3 sides. Habsburg infantry attacked from the east. Starhemberg's detachments attacked from the west. The river cut off any retreat to the south. The fourth side, the north, was held by Habsburg cavalry, which had found a gap in the unfinished outer trench and poured through it like water through a breached dam. The Ottoman defense, which had held firm despite heavy losses, began to disintegrate. Units that had maintained cohesion under frontal assault could not cope with attacks from multiple directions. Janissaries turned to meet threats from behind, leaving their front exposed. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some soldiers tried to break for the bridge. Others formed small defensive squares, preparing to die where they stood. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. But in the smoke and din, no quarter was given. The fighting in the trenches reached a ferocity that veterans would remember as the worst they had ever experienced. Habsburg soldiers scrambled into the ditches, where muskets were useless, and the fight devolved into bayonets, sabers, rifle butts, fists, and teeth. The trenches were 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide, tight spaces that prevented proper blade work, places where one had to stab, hack, and wrestle in the mud. Men slipped on blood, fell on dead comrades, died face down in the muck. The screams became continuous, an inhuman chorus of rage, pain, and horror, drowning out even the artillery. The Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, died in these trenches, killed not by Habsburg soldiers but by his own janissaries. The precise circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts claim he tried to surrender, others that he attempted to flee, a third that he was killed by panicked troops blaming him for the disaster. One thing is certain: his body was later found with multiple saber wounds, and the seal of his office was missing. With the Grand Vizier's death, the Ottoman command structure collapsed entirely. Each unit fought alone, without coordination, without hope. The pontoon bridge, under artillery fire for over an hour, finally began to break apart. A cannonball severed the cable holding the northern section, and half the span floated freely downstream. Soldiers still on the bridge cried out as they realized what was happening. Some tried to jump into the departing boats. Others simply fell into the water, dragged to the bottom by their armor and equipment. The bridge was gone, and with it, any possibility of salvation. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers made a desperate decision. They would swim to the west bank. It was 200 yards of cold, fast water, but it seemed preferable to staying and being killed. They shed their armor, discarded their weapons, and plunged into the Tisza. What they had not reckoned with was that the Habsburg forces now controlled both banks. Sharpshooters lined the bank, firing into the mass of swimmers. The water around the broken bridge turned red. Bodies floated downstream with outstretched arms, carried by a current that cared nothing for empires, causes, or the dreams of young men who would never see their homes again. The sun set on an apocalyptic scene. The battle continued into the darkness, lit by burning wagons and the flashes of gunfire. Ottoman resistance had been broken, but the killing continued. Habsburg soldiers hunted down survivors in the trenches and the camp, enacting revenge for years of war. By midnight, as exhaustion finally brought an end to the violence, the east bank of the Tisza had been transformed into a charnel house. The Ottomans had ceased to exist as a fighting force. They had been annihilated. In the final hours of the battle, mercy vanished. It was no longer a fight between soldiers, but an extermination. Habsburg troops stormed the Ottoman camp, bayoneting the wounded, shooting prisoners, setting tents ablaze. Officers tried to restore discipline, shouting orders to take prisoners for ransom, but the soldiers did not listen. They had marched for 10 hours, fought for another 6, lost friends and brothers, and now they wanted bloody retribution. The janissaries, who might have been spared for their military reputation, died to the last man because they refused to surrender. They died fighting with knives in their hands, curses on their lips, true to their oath even in defeat. The trenches that had served as defensive positions during the battle became mass graves afterward. As Habsburg soldiers systematically searched them the next morning, they found layers of bodies, 3 or 4 deep, Ottoman and Austrian, mingled in death, entwined in their last struggles. The stench was overwhelming. Blood, gunpowder smoke, and earth. Flies arrived in clouds, as did crows and the human scavengers who followed every army to strip the dead of anything valuable. Gold teeth were extracted from corpses, rings cut from swollen fingers. Even the buttons on uniforms were worth taking. But the most horrifying sight occurred in the river. The Tisza had become a conveyor belt of corpses, carrying bodies downstream for miles, depositing them on sandbanks and in the mud of the banks, where they would rot under the autumn sun. Local peasants would spend weeks clearing the river, hauling out the dead, burning them in mass pyres that blackened the sky. The exact number of drowned would never be known. Estimates ranged from 8,000 to 12,000. Men who had survived years of campaigns perished in water over their heads, weighed down by the equipment their commanders had insisted they could not discard. The body of the Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, was found in the trenches, identified by his rich clothing and a distinctive scar on his left arm. He was buried with military honors by the Habsburgs in recognition of a worthy opponent. But 5 provincial governors died alongside him: Pashas of Anatolia, Adana, Diyarbakir, Marash, and Rumelia. 33 agas of various military units were killed. 7 horsetails, banners signifying high Ottoman rank, were captured. An unprecedented humiliation. In a single stroke, the entire command structure of the Ottoman army in Hungary had been decapitated. On the West Bank, Sultan Mustafa II watched his infantry being destroyed. He was overcome by a rage of grief that would plague him for the rest of his short life. Sultan Mustafa II's cavalry was ready for battle, but there was nowhere to advance. The Sultan's artillery could bombard Habsburg positions, but his own soldiers were mixed in with the enemy. The Sultan would have killed as many Ottomans as Christians. The river had paralyzed him, and he was forced to remain inactive, watching his army die. As darkness finally concealed the slaughter, his advisors urged immediate retreat. The Habsburg army might find a ford and attack this side of the river in the night. "We must leave now." "While they cannot," they urged. Mustafa fled. There is no other word for it. He abandoned the battlefield without stopping, fleeing through the night toward Timișoara, discarding anything that slowed his escape. The rich baggage train, laden with the plunder of 3 campaigns, was captured intact. His artillery, 87 heavy cannons that had taken years to cast and months to transport, was seized by Prince Eugene of Savoy's soldiers. The treasury, containing 3 million piastres in gold and silver, fell into Habsburg hands. But worst and most humiliating of all was the loss of the state seal. The seal was the symbol of Ottoman authority, more important than any crown or scepter. Sultans had used it on campaign to authenticate orders and treaties. It bore the inscription, "Mustafa, son of Mehmed Khan. He is always victorious," as well as the year of his accession in the Islamic calendar. No enemy had ever captured the seal of a ruling sultan. It was unthinkable. Blasphemy. Proof of God's displeasure. When news spread throughout the Ottoman Empire that the seal had fallen into Christian hands, people understood that Allah had turned his back on them. The course of events had shifted. Prince Eugene of Savoy rode across the battlefield at dawn, surveying his victory. In some places, bodies lay so thick that his horse had to tread carefully lest it step on them. The smell made Prince Eugene of Savoy cover his mouth with a cloth, but his face showed satisfaction, not horror. He had disobeyed the emperor's orders and gambled his career on a single throw. Now he had proof that he was right. A complete and unconditional victory. The number of Ottoman dead would be debated for centuries. Habsburg dispatches claimed 30,000 were killed in action, and another 10,000 drowned, making a total of 40,000 casualties from an army of 60,000. Ottoman reports, naturally, presented lower figures, from 7,000 to 8,000 dead, acknowledging defeat but not catastrophe. Modern historians arrive at an intermediate estimate: 25,000 Ottomans killed, perhaps 5,000 captured, and another 5,000 so severely wounded that they were abandoned when Mustafa fled. Against this, the Habsburgs lost 429 killed and 1,568 wounded, a casualty ratio of almost 6:1. The numbers cannot convey the scale of the disaster. The Ottoman Empire had lost not just an army, but the flower of its military leadership, its most experienced janissaries, its artillery, its treasury, and its sacred seal. Prince Eugene of Savoy had not merely won a battle, he had inflicted a wound that would never fully heal. The day after the battle, a silence descended over Zenta. The cannons fell quiet. The screams ceased. Only the wind roamed the field, carrying the scent of death. Habsburg soldiers began the grim work of clearing the bodies, stripping them of valuables, separating friend from foe. The dead were identified when possible. Officers' bodies were treated with some respect. Common soldiers were tossed into mass graves with perfunctory prayers. Wounded Ottomans who could not walk were given water and left to their fate. Some survived, most did not. The captured Ottoman baggage train yielded a staggering haul, 9,000 wagons, each laden with supplies, equipment, or personal effects, 6,000 camels and 15,000 oxen, which could feed the Habsburg army for months, 423 battle standards, which would hang in Viennese churches as trophies of victory, the Sultan's personal tent, a pavilion of silk and gold, requiring 40 men to carry, and most importantly, items of symbolic rather than material value, 7 horsetails, the seal of the Grand Vizier, and the state seal of Sultan Mustafa II. Prince Eugene of Savoy personally presented the state seal to Emperor Leopold in Vienna. The ceremony took place in November, following Eugene's triumphant return from a brutal raid into Ottoman Bosnia, where his army had plundered Sarajevo and burned every village within 50 miles. Vienna celebrated with fireworks, religious processions, and public feasts that lasted for days. Pope Innocent XI ordered Te Deums sung in churches across Catholic Europe. Protestant nations, not friends of the Habsburgs, nevertheless congratulated Leopold on his victory. For the first time in memory, Christian Europe was united not by fear of the Turks, but by something else. Eugene was 34 years old, and he had suddenly become the most famous general on the European continent. The French court, which had once mocked his physique and denied him a commission, now spoke his name with grudging respect. Italian rulers commissioned paintings celebrating his triumph. German poets composed epics, comparing him to ancient heroes. He had achieved what every general craves, an unblemished victory, one that ended wars, not prolonged them. In a single day, he had erased the stain on his previous career, where he had served competently but without exceptional brilliance. Now he was Prince Eugene, the noble knight, the savior of Christendom, the scourge of the infidel. The loans that had saved the Habsburg army from bankruptcy were repaid from captured Ottoman treasure. Eugene's personal finances, stretched to the limit by borrowings, were restored and then flourished. He acquired estates, built palaces, becoming not only famous but wealthy. But more important than money or fame was the emperor's trust. Leopold gave Eugene independent command in future campaigns, freeing him from the caution and interference that had hampered previous generals. This trust would lead to further victories. Turin in 1706, where Eugene saved Italy from French conquest. Blenheim in 1704, where he fought side by side with the Duke of Marlborough to crush the armies of Louis XIV. Belgrade in 1717, his masterpiece, where he took a city that had resisted Habsburg sieges for decades. On the Ottoman side, the immediate consequences were catastrophic in every respect. Sultan Mustafa II reached Timisoara in a state of shock. Unable to speak coherently for several days, he had lost more than an army. He had lost his self-confidence, his authority, his sense of divine favor. The psychological trauma proved more devastating than the material losses. In the years after Zenta, Mustafa withdrew increasingly from governance, delegating power to religious authorities and court factions. He became known for his paranoia and indecision. The warrior sultan had become a broken man. The military consequences were immediate and severe. The Ottoman Empire could no longer conduct offensive operations in Hungary. The troops who survived Zenta were scattered and demoralized. Recruiting new janissaries and training them to combat effectiveness would take years. Replacing the artillery was costly and slow. Imperial foundries could produce about 10 guns a year, meaning full restoration would take a decade. The empire's treasury, already depleted by 14 years of war, could not sustain further campaigns. Local governors in the Balkans and Anatolia, sensing weakness, began withholding tax revenues and acting with greater independence. Diplomatically, Zenta forced the Ottomans to accept what they had resisted for decades. They had to negotiate with Christian powers as equals, not dictate terms as conquerors. The Holy League sensed weakness. Austrian envoys demanded territorial concessions. Russian armies advanced on Azov. Venetian fleets raided Ottoman islands with impunity. The Sultan, who had proclaimed he was willing to sacrifice himself for the faith, now begged for peace. Months after Zenta, peace negotiations began in the village of Karlowitz, situated near Belgrade. For 72 days, diplomats from the Ottoman Empire, Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia argued over maps and treaty texts. The Ottomans were represented by capable negotiators, fighting for every point, but they negotiated from a position of weakness. The final treaty, signed on the 26th of January 1699, marked the greatest territorial loss in Ottoman history. Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, Slovenia, all lost and transferred to Habsburg control. Poland regained Podolia, Venice seized Dalmatia and the Morea. In a separate treaty signed the following year, Russia secured Azov and the right to maintain a permanent diplomatic mission in Constantinople. The Treaty of Karlowitz stripped over 160,000 square kilometers of European territory from Ottoman control. For an empire that defined itself through expansion, that justified its existence through holy war and conquest, this represented not merely a defeat but an existential crisis. The Ottomans had been expanding into Europe since 1361, for 338 years. Now, for the first time, they were retreating. The psychological impact was more devastating than the material losses. Sultan Mustafa II never recovered. In 1703, a military revolt, known as the Edirne Event, forced him to abdicate. He spent another 6 years in confinement, dying at the age of 39. His health had been undermined by depression and what modern doctors might diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder. His sons, Mahmud and Osman, would later become sultans, but neither could restore the glory lost by their father at Zenta. The battlefield itself returned to silence. Peasants once again tilled the land, plowing up bones, finding coins and musket balls in the soil. The Tisza River continued to flow, holding no memory of the men who drowned in its waters. For a generation, travelers passing through Zenta would see no evidence that history had changed here, that empires had risen and fallen on this land. However, the consequences of this battle spread through the centuries, redrawing the map of Europe and shaping the destinies of nations for a century to come. The Battle of Zenta marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. This simple sentence hides profound civilizational changes. Since the Ottoman troops crossed the Dinaric Alps in 1354, 3 centuries earlier, the empire had grown relentlessly. One victory followed another. The Balkans were conquered, then Hungary, and raids reached Germany and Italy. Each new generation of sultans expanded the borders. Each success confirmed divine favor for the faithful. Zenta reversed this vector. After the 11th of September 1697, began the long contraction of the Ottoman Empire in Europe, a process that would only end in 1912, when the Balkan Wars stripped it of its last European possessions, save for a small territory around Istanbul. The immediate strategic consequences were clear. The Austrian Habsburgs became the dominant power in Central Europe. They controlled Hungary and used it as a base to extend their influence into the Balkans. The Pannonian Plain, previously a border zone between empires, became an internal territory of Austria. A military frontier was established, a militarized zone where soldier settlers were granted land in exchange for defense against Ottoman raids. This system lasted for over a century, creating an insurmountable barrier that the Ottomans could never again overcome. Russia benefited no less than Austria. With the diminished Ottoman threat, Peter the Great was able to focus on his wars with Sweden on the Baltic Sea. The Treaty of Constantinople granted Russia its first permanent foothold on the Black Sea, a strategic asset that subsequent czars would expand until Russian power dominated the entire northern coast. The centuries-long Russo-Turkish Wars, which had raged through the 15th and 16th centuries, began from a position of strength acquired by Russia. After Zenta, Venice experienced a brief period of resurgence. The recapture of the Morea reopened access for Venetian merchants to Greek trade and the ability to project its power in the Mediterranean. But Venice was a republic in decline, and within 2 decades, it lost the Morea back to the Ottomans. The battle gave Venice breathing room, but it could not reverse its long decline. By the 18th century, Venice was a museum of past glories, living on past achievements rather than present power. Poland-Lithuania regained territories but not vital strength. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had once halted Ottoman expansion at Vienna, was entering its death throes, a victim of weak kings and the interference of neighboring powers. Within a century, Poland would be partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, erased from the map as a sovereign state. Zenta gave Poland a victorious final act, but it was still a final act. For the Habsburg Empire, Zenta marked the beginning of greatness, the same dynasty that would later produce Maria Theresa and rule a multi-ethnic empire stretching from Belgium to Romania. built its power on the foundation laid by Eugene. The acquisition of Hungary provided agricultural wealth, military manpower, and strategic depth. The reputation gained from defeating the Ottomans elevated Habsburg prestige throughout Europe. When the War of the Spanish Succession broke out, Austria fought as a great power, not a desperate defender of Christendom's borders. The philosophical significance of Zenta extended beyond territorial shifts in the balance of power. The battle marked a shift in European consciousness from defense to offense, from survival to dominance. For generations, European politics had been shaped by the pressure of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that pressure was gone, and Europeans could direct their competitive energies at each other, rather than uniting against a common threat. The wars of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, were all intra-European conflicts fought without the shadow of Constantinople looming over them. The Ottoman Empire became what historians call the sick man of Europe, a phrase that would echo for 2 centuries. The sickness was not just military or economic, but psychological. An empire that defined itself by conquest, that built its institutions around continuous expansion, could not easily adapt to contraction and defense. Reformist efforts would be made. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, westernization of the army and administration. But nothing could return the empire to its former trajectory. The fundamental fact established at Zenta remained unchanged. Christian Europe had grown stronger than Muslim Turkey, and this imbalance would only increase. Prince Eugene of Savoy continued to build one of the most distinguished military careers in history. After Zenta came Turin, where he relieved the city's siege by French forces and saved Italy for Austria, then Blenheim, where he fought alongside the Duke of Marlborough to shatter the armies of Louis XIV at the height of his power. Following were Oudenarde and Malplaquet. These brutal victories crushed France's offensive potential. In 1716 and 1717, Eugene clashed with the Ottoman Empire once more. His victory at Petrovaradin and the capture of Belgrade in a campaign recognized as his masterpiece became legendary. Decades later, Napoleon, studying military history, would name Eugene among the 7 greatest commanders of all time, alongside Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar. Eugene died in 1736 at the age of 73, remaining the last of the great commanders whose careers spanned the transition from the early modern to the modern era. He left no heirs, as he never married. However, his contribution to European military thought influenced generations. The priority of aggressive offensive action, the willingness to ignore orders when opportunity presented itself, and the use of speed and surprise to overcome numerical superiority. All of these became foundational doctrines thanks to Eugene's proven effectiveness. Sultan Mustafa II is remembered, if at all, as the ruler who lost Hungary. His early triumphs at Lugos and Ulas became minor episodes against the backdrop of the Zenta catastrophe. His poetic works, written under the pseudonym Mufidi, are studied by specialists in Ottoman literature but remain unknown to the general public. His sons, such as Mahmud II, ruled competently but without notable success. The dynasty of warrior sultans, who personally led their troops, ended with Mustafa's death. Future rulers would issue commands from palaces, not battlefields, presiding over decline, not conquest. Today, the battlefield of Zenta lies in silence. Here, the Tisza still flows languidly between its muddy banks. Grass conceals the earth where trenches once lay. A small monument marks the site, attracting history buffs and ignored by everyone else. The pontoon bridge has long since vanished, though the ford remains where Ottoman soldiers once attempted to cross the river, dooming themselves. Local farmers sometimes unearth ancient artifacts, musket balls, belt buckles, coins bearing the likenesses of forgotten emperors. These relics find their way into museums or private collections, becoming silent witnesses to the day 2 empires met and one was destroyed. Centuries later, the consequences of that September day continue to shape our world. The borders established after Zenta influenced the shape of post-World War I borders, which in turn influenced the modern map of Europe. The Ottoman retreat from Europe created a power vacuum that fueled Balkan nationalism that contributed to the outbreak of World War I and the Yugoslav conflicts of the 1990s. The sick man of Europe finally died in 1922, giving way to the secular Turkish Republic. However, the ghost of Ottoman greatness still haunts Turkish politics. At Zenta, On a day that began with mist over the river and ended with the water turned red with blood, Prince Eugene of Savoy made a decision whose echoes are felt to this day. He chose attack against direct orders, risking his career and his army in a single gamble. He won, and with that victory, he changed the course of civilizations. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed eternal, began its long decline. Christian Europe, which had lived in fear for centuries, found its confidence and became aggressive. The modern world, with all its imbalances and contradictions, was partly shaped by what happened when two armies clashed at a river crossing on the Hungarian plains. The battle lasted 6 hours. Its consequences are still felt today.